what is it? It's February and it's already exhausting.
This, though, is like post-convention nasty.
Right. Well, I think Bloomberg is trying to show Democrats how tough he can be. And a lot of Democrats will find that kind of, like, oh, that's exactly what we need. We need to be just like him.
Well, he baited Trump. I mean, he has a point.
Trying to beat Trump at his own game, I'm not sure. Maybe that's the best way to do it. I'm not sure. But, Bloomberg's team has been super savvy. They got a little bit lucky with the Iowa caucus being such a mess. Biden doing so badly, but they're really making, they're not waiting till Super Tuesday to enter the fray. They're like taking advantage of these sort of the week before New Hampshire, before Nevada, when things are kind of quiet. And I think it's really smart. And, Joe Biden says that South Carolina is his firewall, but voters are not waiting till South Carolina to panic. They're panicking now. And we have no idea if Mike Bloomberg has any ability to turn out voters. We know he's doing well in polls. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But it does seem that he is ending up the benefit of Biden's collapse more so than Buttigieg or Klobuchar.
Rev.
I think that you're not going to see Bloomberg do the Donald Trump, outdo Trump. That's Mike Bloomberg. I mean, those of us that I've known Bloomberg as long as I've known Trump, and I've fought him and worked with him. And Bloomberg is that kind of shoot from the hip. I can, be just as guttural as you can. And I think that it is going to be that kind of match if they ever end up being the ones that face each other. And I think the fact that he's not trying to do Trump, that it's going to come across as him, works for him. I think he has other issues he's going to have to deal with. But in terms of back and forward, you're going to see a real contest on who can come with the more offensive kind of way to deal with things. But the thing that I think that she touched on that is important, the other thing that I think broke for Bloomberg inadvertently is when we saw the same voter turnout in Iowa that we saw in 2016.
Right.
And we saw the increase in New Hampshire, but it was in the suburbs for Klobuchar or for Buttigieg. The surge that Bernie promised has not surfaced. So we don't know if we're going to have a real singular candidate going in to Super Tuesday or not, because Bernie's talking about he has higher youth votes among his percentage, but that was not higher among the turnout was not higher because of that. So I think that we are really beginning to see, wait a minute, we don't know if Bloomberg can get a vote, but the votes we've seen so far has not showed us this great surge that we were promised.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.